Hi everybody, my name is Diane Roberts and I'm an artist. Now, I wanted to talk about this painting with you, and actually a series of paintings that I've done, which I did in my youth actually, because early in the 80s I was very struck by becoming a what we call feminist artist, and in result, you know, we now have a far more equality in galleries and more inclusiveness in every situation. But in the 80s it was very necessary for women to proclaim art for themselves, really. And it was second wave feminism, and these paintings were done in 1983. I was sort of fresh out of art college, and I was immersed in the London scene and very interested in women's art and, you know, proclaiming our status in some way. And I embarked on a series of paintings which came from my spiritual experiences and my linking to my cultural faith. Took me to the story of Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc being a female heroine of the faith. I have my reservations about the whole thing now in hindsight, but at the time it seemed a good starting point for me to establish my identity. So I looked into this story of Joan of Arc. I found out about her visions in Fatima, how she was called to save the Dauphin, who was the not yet crowned king of France, but who had to be taken to Chartres Cathedral, I believe, to be throned properly before he became King of France. And of course it was in the war between the English, and so many terrible things happened, and I can't really comprehend those things really. In hindsight, I probably wouldn't have chosen something so aggressive and so warlike. But for me, in my naive state as I was then, being honest, I wanted to make a large series of work, and I used my particular style at that time, which is like a bit of psycho pop, shall we say, inspired by the American pop artists, and also inspired by my use of screen printing. So it made my work somewhat original and somewhat different. If I can just describe this painting before I go on to other paintings in the series, this one particularly has a series of grids behind it, which I focused on. I'll put a screenshot later of this. Underneath the patterns that you see here, there are grids, this grid system. This is formed by screen print to the raw canvas with screen printing ink. It was a photographic process, but the drawing I did was then transferred to the screen. So I got this repeat imagery, which goes throughout the whole of the series. These pictures were taken from graphic images of unfortunate torture of women, and my own self-portrait, as I saw myself in some respect being related to these torture victims. A bit horrific now to think about that, but at that time for me that was the nearest I could come to feeling that experience, that I felt very discriminated against, very tortured in some respect. And over the top of this screen print, it was then stretched onto canvas. I then superimposed this impressive figure of Joan of Arc, with her banner and her sword and her armour, because she was like a pageant to the French army. She went into war like before everybody else, so she was you know, a lucky charm, shall we say. And we actually don't know what she looked like there are no portraits of Joan of Arc. But the interesting thing about this particular image was because she was caught and then tried in a terrible trial before she was burnt at the stake by the English. And the English people who were documenting the trials must have got so bored at some point, but he actually did a little cartoon character at the side of his inscriptions of copying all the translation of everything that happened during the court, people's responses, people's answers to questions. And this was a little image that he did of her. So in actual fact, it is the only portrait of her in existence. Everything else has been done in people's mind's eye as a fictitious character, or, you know, just making it up in their heads. So this character here, this figure, outlined in the black with red, is the drawing which was in the script of the trials that took place. And over this, I then, in gold, and there's 1, 2, 3 actual very simplified pictures of angels, and these were the angels that Joan believed were with her during this quest to find the dolphin and to bring him to be crowned the proper King of France. And it was quite interesting because she did have foresight. The dolphin, when she came as a young girl to find him, he was in hiding, of course. He put himself in a sort of a lineup with other people, other men, of course, and she had to pick him out from this lineup to prove that she had insight from God. And lo and behold, during that process, when she found him and came across as this young girl who'd had this wonderful vision in Fatima of these 3 angels or 3 children coming to her and telling her this vision and what she was to do, she picked him out from this lineup, proving that she had insight from God. Welcome everybody. Here's the second part of this video talking about my series of Joan of Arc, painted in the 80s. Well, this painting here, welcome to my studio space, by the way, is one of the 3rd paintings in the series. I specifically pointed this one out because it shows very clearly my progression into feminism and my individual idiosyncratic journey into my understanding of myself as a woman and piecing together so many things in the world, really. In the 80s we watched a lot of films, and film footage was important. We could talk together in groups about films we'd seen, make comments about them, and it would be a point of interest of something. So continuing this investigation into Joan of Arc and her as a symbol of a heroic woman, I was very fascinated and dug back into my childhood memories of films that I'd seen on television, black and white in those days, in my early childhood, of how she'd been represented in films and by the characters. So this painting in some respects represents my investigation into the cinema world and her representation. So again, how an image of a woman can be translated and changed by media, and it's a very deep subject, but I'm just touching the surface of it. So for me, as a painter at the time, I was very fascinated by the artists, the actresses who had played her, and I went back into the archives and watched the films. And this portrait here is of the first person who lovely lady who actually played her. Her name is Geraldine Ferrara, and she took part in this black and white film. Quite amazingly done, actually, and beautiful footage. The next person I looked at is, of course, our famous Ingrid Bergman, who was an amazing actress of the 50s and 40s, I believe, and had this incredible bone structure. And then also she had a catchphrase of I want to be alone. Down this painting a little bit for you. Again, I've got the grids in, of course, a different colour, screen prints first on this painting, the group. Again, these are rather gruesome images which are repeated but in a different colour phase. And then again, if you look closely, we called it at the time, I was experimenting with what we called colour field painting, so that we could look at the painting at one level and then we could look at it at another level. So we were creating another sort of 3D effect rather than perspective, but of course it is perspective, not real true colour field painting. So we've got floating over these are modelled images from photographic pictures that I took during the film of the people playing her in costume. And then the larger yellow shapes are cartoon type images of her again acting in these various guises. So we've got floating over the whole surface this rather large face here of Ingrid Bergman showing her beautiful bone structure. Again, coming from the top, another figure, one central figure, face portrait, and another side portrait here, silhouette portrait, and another one there on the corner. So it can be viewed, so to speak, at different levels. And that was something I was playing with at the time. Here is from the Joan of Arc period, and I'm going to break it down for you and tell you why I painted it and the reason, and of course, as a feminist artist of the 80s, how I was thinking and my mental situation at the time. Welcome to my studio space. Now, this painting is quite a deep one for me. Because it has again something quite gruesome rooted in it, that I was obviously deeply affected by at the time, and I think this expresses quite a bit about how women were feeling at the time and how situations of the media could manipulate and think about, make you think very deeply about situations. So very autobiographical, this painting. Again, because I painted it when I was young, it's got a lot of ambiguities in it, which now I would never paint a painting like this. But because it was done in the 80s, I feel that justified to talk about it, and because I was an artist of that period of time. So let's go and break this down into the Joan of Arc period. It came later on in the series. I was very disgusted by war, by conflicts. We had the Falklands War, which affected me, which I had done a series of work on. War and conflict was still carrying on in the world, and I felt very threatened by certain situations, personally, by where I happened to live at that time. Period, again, I was experimenting with colour field, with screen printing, with sort of like a psycho pop type of imagery, perhaps cartoony in some respects. And we can see here that I've done the grid system behind. I'll give you a shot of that close up so you can see it in detail. And again, it's the same quite gruesome screen print which is underneath the whole of the series. Some of it comes through, some of it goes back. So I again did a lot of research in the British Museum and reading. I couldn't read Latin, so I had to rely on other people's translations and things, but looking further into the witch trials that had happened and how Joan of Arc was treated when she was caught by the English and tortured, and of course died, burned at the stake as a witch. for her spiritual beliefs. So we've got images here from manuscripts, and we've got a very weird figure here that came in. Now if we can see the model figure on this side and this side of the painting. Now this may be very offensive to people, and I do apologise for anyone who can get damaged by this, but this image is of the person called the Yorkshire Ripper. Peter Sutcliffe, who has now passed away, because when I was younger, let's say I was a student, and I was in Yorkshire, lived in Yorkshire, and for those people who want to do the research about the Yorkshire Ripper, he was active in that area when I was a young girl. I was a student, and obviously did things that students did, but it restricted my movements. The media, newspapers, constantly were reporting about the horrific deaths of firstly prostitutes. So the media took that to town, newspapers, television, that he focused on ladies of the street, shall we say, the most vulnerable part of our community, and attacked them and killed them brutally. Can you imagine how that affected me as a young woman? Living in that area, you never felt quite sure whether something might happen to you. It restricted your movements. You didn't make sure that you had a lot of fear. You carried a lot of fear in your body. And then, of course, later on in the processing, he then, of course, chose to kill students, women students, and of course that again meant that he'd widened his catchment area of people he could torture and kill, and the media was just full of fear. I just talking about it now, being alive in that period of time and being a young woman on a campus, going about my student duties and stuff as I was a student in that period, and at that time of year, time of part of the world, it was just so fearful. It did leave quite a lot. It stopped my movements quite a bit. It stopped me being as open and unfearing with people. So with the local community, I would probably not talk to people, men, in quite the same way, because we always assumed that it was a man who was the predator. It did make a big impact. And I don't know if people have researched that, but I think people who lived in that period, young ladies who lived in that area, may have this type of psychological feeling in their body, because I can feel it actually coming up now, a sense of fear. You know, I would make sure that I wasn't alone at night time. I would make sure that I was supported by other people around me. Even though that I didn't really feel, a target, but it was always a possibility, isn't it? It's in your mind. And I think it was a mind fear that was generated by media, and I felt threatened by the media and by other people, and making new relationships, making friendships with people. Thank you for letting me express that. So let me continue with this painting after that cathartic outburst. I do apologise, but it gives you an impact of what this painting holds for me. So we've got Joan of Arc, fearless with her weapon. Again, this is this beautiful image that I utilised, from the manuscripts I found, heroically going into battle, because it was all about, if conquest at that time was always about rape and pillage. You know, I mean, whether they didn't touch Joan of Arc or not, I don't know. But, you know, every other women in those situations were definitely just a fodder for this type of war. You know, this type of brutal conflict, tribal conflict. And, you know, there we've got men in their armour, you know, weapons in hand, you know, like things being thrown down from battlements. You know, there's castles. We romanticise about it now. But actually that was the horrific warfare of death, rape and pillage, barriers, you know, just horrific. So, I don't know. Perhaps someone can psychoanalyse me from this. But anyway, this was what the painting's about, and I wanted to express that. Thank you for letting me express it to you. Bye bye for now.